I live in Portugal now. The light here is different, cleaner somehow, and my blood pressure hasn't spiked in 18 months. People back home think I orchestrated what happened to Rebecca's new partner. They believe I pulled strings from across an ocean, that I dismantled him deliberately. I didn't, but I understand why they think so. When a man leaves his marriage, relocates to another continent, and then watches his replacement unravel publicly, the timeline suggests intention. It wasn't like that. Not exactly. My name is Martin Hale. I'm 57. For 28 years, I was married to a woman who cultivated appearances the way other people cultivate gardens, carefully, persistently, with an eye toward what the neighbors might see. Rebecca wasn't cruel in any way you could photograph. She was polished. Our marriage looked like success. Good jobs, good neighborhood, 2 children who went to good schools. She worked in marketing for a healthcare firm. I spent 3 decades in infrastructure compliance and logistics consulting. The kind of work that sounds boring until a bridge doesn't collapse or a supply chain doesn't fail. Quiet work. Invisible work. The marriage became invisible too, but in a different way. It's difficult to explain how a relationship empties out. There were no affairs, no screaming matches, no thrown dishes, just a slow, relentless diminishment. Rebecca had a way of correcting me in public that seemed helpful to observers. A light touch on my arm, a gentle clarification of something I'd said, a small laugh that suggested I'd gotten a detail charmingly wrong. In private, there was less correction because there was less of me to correct. I learned which opinions to keep to myself, which observations wouldn't be worth the subtle reframe that would follow. Our conversations became transactional. Schedules, finances, the children. I stopped bringing up things that mattered to me around year 19. Not because she forbade it, but because the pattern had calcified. I would mention something I'd been thinking about, a book, a concern about our son, a question about our future, and she would absorb it with a nod, then redirect to something more pressing, something more hers. Eventually I realized I had become a supporting character in a narrative I had no hand in writing. Our children were grown by the time I left. Daniel, 31, works in finance in Chicago. He inherited his mother's instinct for image management. When the divorce proceedings began, he phoned me once, voice tight, and asked why I was doing this to her. I didn't have an answer that would satisfy him. Cassie, 28, teaches middle school in Denver. She didn't ask why. She said very quietly that she'd noticed I'd stopped smiling in family photos around the time she was in high school. I hadn't realized it was that obvious. The medical event happened 14 months before I left. Not a full stroke. My doctor called it a transient ischemic attack, a warning shot. I was in a hotel in Minneapolis, wrapping up a project assessment, when my left hand stopped responding correctly. It lasted 90 seconds, enough to terrify me, enough to get me into a cardiologist's office the next week. He was blunt, stress, blood pressure, cortisol patterns that suggested chronic activation. He used the phrase, "Your body is trying to tell you something." I remember sitting in that office looking at charts I didn't fully understand and feeling a strange clarity. I was going to die if I stayed in this marriage. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone could point to, but incrementally, year by year, until my heart or my brain simply gave out under the weight of being erased. I told Rebecca that night. She was reviewing a presentation for work, laptop open on the kitchen island. I explained the diagnosis, the warning, what the doctor had said. She looked up, frowned with what seemed like genuine concern, and asked if I needed her to come to the follow-up appointment. I said it might help. She checked her calendar and said Thursday didn't work, but she could move things around for the following week. Then she returned to her presentation. I stood there for a moment, waiting for something more. A question, a hand on my shoulder, anything. Nothing came. She was already gone, back into her screen. That's when I knew. I didn't leave immediately. I'm methodical by training. I spent 6 months organizing my exit, finding a consulting arrangement that allowed remote work, researching countries with favorable residency visas for retirees and independent professionals, selling off what I didn't need. Rebecca noticed the decluttering but assumed it was a health kick. She encouraged it even, said it was good I was finally taking initiative about something. I told her I wanted a divorce on a Sunday morning in March. We were sitting in the living room. She had coffee. I had none. I'd stopped drinking it months earlier, part of the protocol to lower my blood pressure. She stared at me for a long time, and I watched her expression shift through several phases. Confusion, disbelief, something that looked like anger but was really affronted dignity. She asked if there was someone else. There wasn't. She asked if this was about the health scare. I said it was about wanting to be alive in more than a technical sense. She didn't fight me on the terms. The house was paid off. We split assets cleanly. She kept the house. I kept my sanity and a reasonable portion of our retirement accounts. The children were informed separately. Daniel was appalled. Cassie was quiet, but she hugged me longer than usual when I saw her next. By summer, I was gone. I didn't stage a dramatic exit. I didn't write a manifesto or burn bridges. I hired movers, forwarded my mail, and boarded a flight to Lisbon with 2 suitcases and a consulting contract that would sustain me for the foreseeable future. Rebecca told people I'd had some kind of breakdown, that I'd abandoned her after nearly 3 decades, that she was stunned, blindsided, humiliated. I let her have that narrative. It cost me nothing, and I was an ocean away. I didn't choose Portugal, I chose Krakow. It wasn't romantic, it was practical. Low cost of living, decent infrastructure, a growing expat community that didn't ask too many questions. I rented a 2-bedroom apartment in Kazimierz, near the old Jewish quarter, and set up a home office that looked out onto a quiet courtyard. My consulting work continued remotely. Compliance audits, risk assessments, the occasional project review for firms that needed someone who understood regulatory frameworks across multiple jurisdictions. The work was steady, undemanding, and allowed me to live modestly without drawing attention. The first 3 months were disorienting, not because I regretted leaving, but because my body didn't believe it yet. I would wake at 3 a.m., heart racing, convinced I'd forgotten something critical. It took weeks to realize there was nothing to forget. No tension waiting for me in the next room. No careful calibration required before speaking. I started walking every morning along the Vistula, sometimes for an hour, sometimes more. My resting heart rate dropped. The headaches that had been constant for years simply stopped. By autumn, I felt like I was thinking clearly for the first time in a decade. News from home arrived in fragments. I still spoke to Cassie every few weeks, brief video calls where she told me about her students and avoided mentioning her mother unless I asked. Daniel called less frequently, usually when he needed advice on something technical, a contract clause, a logistics snafu at his firm. He was polite but distant, and I didn't push. I understood his loyalty. Rebecca had raised him to value coherence, and my departure had disrupted that. I learned about Rebecca's new relationship the way most people learn things now, through the shallow archaeology of social media. I didn't follow her accounts, but mutual friends did, and algorithms have a way of surfacing what you're not looking for. A photo appeared in my feed one evening, Rebecca at some kind of gala, smiling beside a man I didn't recognize. Tall, salt and pepper hair, expensive glasses, the kind of confident posture that photographs well. The caption mentioned something about sustainable development and public-private partnerships. His name was Trevor Ashford. I didn't think much of it at first. Rebecca was entitled to move on, and I had no claim to her life anymore. But over the following weeks, his presence became harder to ignore. He appeared in more photos. Rebecca's posts, previously focused on her work, and carefully curated home aesthetics now included references to conferences, panel discussions, initiatives with vague but impressive-sounding names. Trevor was always nearby, speaking at a podium, shaking hands with someone whose title included multiple capital letters, standing beside Rebecca with the easy familiarity of someone who belonged. I looked him up eventually. Curiosity, not jealousy. His LinkedIn profile described him as a senior advisor in sustainable infrastructure and public sector innovation. The language was broad, catalyzing transformational change, bridging policy and impact, leveraging cross-sector synergies. His employment history listed several organizations I didn't recognize, each with names that sounded significant without being specific. There were photos of him at international conferences, Geneva, Brussels, Nairobi. Testimonials from colleagues describing him as visionary, dynamic, essential. It felt like a very polished surface with nothing underneath. Daniel mentioned him during one of our calls. He'd met Trevor at a dinner Rebecca had hosted, some gathering for her firm's leadership team. Daniel was impressed. Trevor had talked about a project in East Africa, something involving renewable energy and rural infrastructure, and Daniel found it compelling. He used the word inspiring. I asked what organization Trevor worked for currently, and Daniel hesitated, then said something about independent consulting and advisory boards. I didn't press. Cassie was less enthusiastic. She mentioned him once, briefly, and her tone was careful. She said Trevor talked a lot, that he had a way of filling a room without saying much of substance. I asked if Rebecca seemed happy, and Cassie paused before answering. "She seems occupied," she said. I told myself it wasn't my concern. Rebecca's choices were her own. If she found someone who made her feel valued, that was fine. I had no interest in monitoring her life or judging her relationships. But something about Trevor nagged at me. Not jealousy, not possessiveness, but a professional instinct I developed over decades of reviewing projects and vetting contractors. The feeling you get when the narrative is too smooth, when the credentials are listed but never verified, when timelines compress in ways that shouldn't be possible. I started noticing inconsistencies, small things. A post mentioned Trevor advising a government ministry in Kenya on energy policy, but the dates overlapped with a conference he'd supposedly keynoted in Stockholm. Another post referenced a fellowship at an institute I'd never heard of, and when I searched for it, the website looked recent. Clean design, minimal content, no archived presence. His recommendations on LinkedIn were effusive but generic, written in the same style of grand abstraction he seemed to favor. No one mentioned specific outcomes. No one cited measurable results. I thought about reaching out to Rebecca, not to warn her I had no proof of anything, but to ask carefully whether she'd verified his background. But I knew how that would sound. The bitter ex-husband, unable to let go, inventing problems where none existed. She wouldn't hear it from me. Daniel certainly wouldn't. And Cassie, though more perceptive, wasn't in a position to intervene, so I watched from a distance and said nothing. Trevor's visibility continued to grow. He was quoted in an article about climate resilience. He appeared on a podcast discussing the future of sustainable urban planning. Rebecca posted a photo of them at a fundraiser, her hand on his arm. Both of them dressed in a way that suggested they were people who mattered. The comments were congratulatory. Friends told her she deserved this, that she looked radiant, that it was wonderful to see her thriving. I sat in my apartment in Krakow, 5 time zones away, and felt a growing unease I couldn't justify and wouldn't act on. Not yet. I spent 30 years reading proposals that looked credible until you checked the footnotes. Infrastructure projects funded by consortiums that dissolved 6 months later. Compliance frameworks cited from standards that didn't exist. Consultants who listed affiliations with institutions that had never heard of them. You develop an eye for it, Not cynicism exactly, but a practiced skepticism. You learn that the more impressive the language, the more carefully you need to verify the foundation underneath. Trevor's public profile had that quality. Everything sounded significant. Nothing held still long enough to be examined. I didn't set out to investigate him. I'm not a detective, and I had no authority in Rebecca's life anymore. But my work requires due diligence, and old habits are hard to break. When I saw him cited as a senior fellow at something called the Global Institute for Sustainable Transitions, I searched for the organization. The website existed. Professional design, stock photos of wind turbines and smiling children in classrooms. But there was no staff directory, no annual report, no record of incorporation. The About page described a mission. It did not describe operations. I checked the domain registration. It had been created 8 months earlier. That didn't prove anything. New organizations emerge constantly, and not all of them have deep web footprints. But it was a data point. I started collecting others, not systematically, but passively, the way you notice a pattern without meaning to. A LinkedIn post mentioned Trevor's work with a renewable energy initiative in Tanzania. I knew someone who had done actual infrastructure work in East Africa, a former colleague who now ran logistics for an NGO in Dar es Salaam. I sent a casual message asking if he'd heard of the project Trevor described. He hadn't. He checked with his network. No one had. Another post referenced a keynote Trevor had delivered at a summit on climate adaptation in Copenhagen. I found the summit's program online. His name wasn't listed. There was a panel on adaptation strategies, but the speakers were academics and ministry officials, no independent consultants. The inconsistencies weren't dramatic. They were small gaps, the kind that might be explained by timing, by miscommunication, by the messy reality of how credit gets assigned in collaborative work. But they accumulated, and the more I noticed, the more I realized that Trevor's career, at least as he described it, existed primarily in his own narration. Third-party validation was always somewhere else, another country, another organization, another context that was just difficult enough to verify that no one bothered. I thought about saying something to Daniel. He'd become more involved with Trevor by then. Rebecca had introduced them properly at some kind of networking event, and Daniel, who'd always been ambitious and image-conscious, saw an opportunity. Trevor moved in circles Daniel wanted access to. People who spoke at conferences, who sat on advisory boards, who had the kind of resumes that opened doors. They'd started meeting for coffee. Daniel mentioned it during one of our calls, his tone warmer than it had been in months. He said Trevor had insights into public sector consulting that might help him pivot his career. I asked what organization Trevor currently worked for. Daniel said Trevor operated independently, that he had the kind of reputation that allowed him to move between projects without being tied to a single firm. I asked if Daniel had seen any of his published work. Daniel hesitated, then said Trevor's work was mostly advisory, confidential, high level, not the kind of thing that appeared in public reports. I tried once more. I said carefully that it might be worth verifying some of Trevor's affiliations before Daniel became too publicly associated with him. The silence on the other end of the call was cold. "This is about Mom, isn't it?" Daniel said finally. I told him it wasn't. "You can't stand that she's happy, that she found someone successful." I said that wasn't true, that I only wanted him to be careful about who he aligned himself with professionally. "You left," Daniel said, his voice hard. "You don't get to have opinions about her life anymore, or mine." He ended the call. I didn't bring it up again. Cassie was more receptive, but only slightly. I mentioned, in passing, that I'd noticed some inconsistencies in Trevor's background. She sighed. She said she'd noticed too. Small things, moments where his stories didn't quite line up. But she also said that Rebecca seemed happier than she'd been in years. that Trevor paid attention to her in ways I hadn't, and that maybe some exaggeration was harmless if it made her mother feel valued. I understood her position. I didn't agree with it, but I understood it. The moral tension was clear. If I pushed harder, if I contacted people directly, if I compiled evidence, if I approached Rebecca or Daniel with a dossier of inconsistencies, I would be the vindictive ex-husband. Every true thing I uncovered would be tainted by my proximity to it. Daniel would dismiss it as bitterness. Rebecca would see it as sabotage. Even Cassie, who trusted me more, would question my motives. The only way the truth could matter was if it came from somewhere else. I realized, sitting in my apartment one evening as winter settled over Krakow, that I couldn't expose Trevor. Not directly. Any action I took would be read as revenge, and revenge poisons truth. People would defend him just to spite me. The narrative would become about my inability to let go, not about whether his claims were real. But the truth had a way of surfacing on its own. People like Trevor, people who built careers on projection rather than substance, eventually encountered someone who checked the references, who asked for documentation, who needed proof instead of performance. It was only a matter of time. I just had to wait. And I had to accept that when it happened, I would have no control over how it unfolded. The event was a regional summit on sustainable development, hosted by a coalition of municipal governments and private sector partners in Minneapolis. Mid-tier in terms of prestige. Not Davos, but not negligible either. The kind of gathering that attracts earnest public administrators, consultants angling for contracts, and a handful of academics. Trevor had been invited to participate in a panel on financing climate resilience projects. According to the program, which I found later, he was listed as a senior advisor with expertise in public-private partnerships and international development frameworks. I wasn't there. I learned about what happened the way most people did, through fragmented social media posts, a few news articles in local business journals, and eventually through a phone call from Cassie. The panel itself was unremarkable for the first 30 minutes. 4 speakers, each given time to present their perspective, followed by a moderated discussion. Trevor spoke third. His remarks were polished, full of the language he favored, catalyzing investment, leveraging stakeholder engagement, scaling impact across geographies. He referenced projects in East Africa and Southeast Asia, mentioned partnerships with multilateral organizations, and described frameworks he'd helped design for integrating climate adaptation into municipal budgets. Then the questions began. One of the other panelists, a woman named Dr. Lee Morrison, who worked for a development finance institution, asked Trevor to clarify which specific projects he'd been involved with in Kenya. She said it conversationally, the way colleagues do when they're genuinely curious. Trevor answered with the name of a rural electrification initiative and mentioned a partnership with the Kenyan Ministry of Energy. Dr. Morrison nodded, then said she'd worked extensively in that sector and hadn't come across that particular initiative. She asked which years he'd been involved. Trevor provided a time frame. Dr. Morrison, still polite, said that didn't align with the ministry's programmatic priorities during that period. She asked if he meant a different initiative, or perhaps a different ministry. The moderator tried to redirect, but someone in the audience, a man affiliated with a transparency-focused NGO, spoke up. He said he'd tried to verify some of Trevor's credentials before the event and had been unable to locate several of the organizations listed in his biography. He asked respectfully if Trevor could clarify his current institutional affiliation. Trevor responded that he operated as an independent advisor and that much of his work was confidential. The man nodded and said he understood, but noted that the Global Institute for Sustainable Transitions, which Trevor had listed as a senior fellowship, had no publicly available governance structure or funding sources. He asked if Trevor could provide more detail about the Institute's operations. The room had gone quiet. Trevor's response was smooth but vague, something about the Institute being in a formative stage, about prioritizing impact over visibility. But the tone had shifted. Dr. Morrison asked a follow-up question about a publication Trevor had cited in his remarks. She said she'd searched for it and couldn't find it in any major database. Trevor said it had been published through a specialized platform with limited distribution. Another panelist, a city budget director, asked about a methodology Trevor had mentioned for climate risk assessment. He said it sounded interesting and asked where he could read more about it. Trevor said the methodology was proprietary, still being refined. Someone in the audience began live-checking claims on their phone. Within minutes, others were doing the same. A post appeared on Twitter, now X, from an attendee. Panelists at Daashwer sustain MPLS, making claims that don't check out. Anyone else noticing this? The moderator, visibly uncomfortable, tried to move the discussion forward, but the atmosphere had already collapsed. The questions continued, no longer collegial. Someone asked about a fellowship Trevor had listed at a European university. The university's website, pulled up in real time, showed no record of him. Another attendee asked about a project in the Philippines. A local journalist covering the summit began writing. Trevor's composure held, but barely. He deflected, appealed to the complexity of international work, suggested that perhaps some details had been miscommunicated in his materials. But the more he spoke, the less solid anything seemed. By the time the panel ended, no one was interested in the original topic. The room had become an impromptu audit. Rebecca was in the audience. I don't know if she'd planned to attend or if Trevor had invited her. Cassie told me later that Rebecca had been sitting near the front, visibly proud at the beginning and visibly shaken by the end. Someone posted a photo from the event, not of Trevor, but of the audience during the Q&A. Rebecca is visible in the second row, her expression frozen, hands gripping the edge of her seat. The news spread quickly. A local business reporter wrote a piece titled, "Consultants' Credentials Questioned at Sustainability Summit." It wasn't scathing, just factual. It listed the claims Trevor had made, the questions that had been raised, and the lack of available verification. Other outlets picked it up. LinkedIn began scrubbing quietly. Some of Trevor's endorsements disappeared. The Global Institute for Sustainable Transition's website went offline. Daniel called me 4 days later. His voice was flat, stripped of the defensiveness I'd come to expect. He said he'd been contacted by someone at his firm, asking if he'd known that Trevor's background was under scrutiny. He said he'd defended Trevor initially, insisted there must be a misunderstanding. Then he'd started checking himself. The projects didn't exist. The affiliations were unverifiable. The fellowship Trevor had mentioned, one Daniel had considered applying for based on Trevor's encouragement, wasn't real. "I don't understand," Daniel said. "Why would he lie about all of it?" I didn't have an answer that would help him. "Did you know?" he asked. I told him I'd had concerns, that I'd noticed inconsistencies but hadn't been certain. "Why didn't you say something?" I paused. I said that I had once, and he'd told me I was bitter. That anything I'd said would have sounded like an attack. That the truth had to come from somewhere it couldn't be dismissed. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Mom's a mess." I asked if she was okay. "I don't know, she won't talk about it. She just keeps saying people are misunderstanding him." I told Daniel I was sorry. I meant it. Cassie called later that same week. She said Rebecca had stopped answering calls from most people, that Trevor had left town, no forwarding information, that the humiliation was public and total. I sat in my apartment, looking out at the Krakow evening, and felt nothing like vindication, just a distant, quiet sadness. The unraveling took months, not because the truth was complicated, but because people needed time to accept what had been in front of them all along. Trevor disappeared within 2 weeks of the summit. No formal statement, no apology, just absence. His LinkedIn profile went dormant, then vanished entirely. The few organizations that had listed him as an advisor quietly removed his name from their websites. A small investigation by a financial oversight body in Minnesota found that he'd solicited consulting fees from 2 municipalities for services never rendered, though the amounts were modest enough that no criminal charges were pursued. He hadn't stolen enough to warrant prosecution, just enough to confirm the pattern. Rebecca's fallout was slower and more personal. She'd introduced Trevor into her professional circles, brought him to company events, vouched for his expertise to colleagues who trusted her judgment. When his fabrications became public, the embarrassment radiated outward. She wasn't blamed exactly, but she was diminished by association. People who had admired her taste and discernment now questioned it. Invitations to industry functions became less frequent. Her firm didn't reprimand her, but a planned promotion was quietly deferred. Cassie told me Rebecca had stopped posting on social media entirely, that she'd taken a leave of absence from work, citing stress, that she was seeing a therapist but wouldn't discuss Trevor, wouldn't acknowledge what had happened beyond saying she'd been deceived. I asked Cassie how she was holding up. She said it was hard to watch, but that Rebecca had built so much of her identity on appearances that admitting error felt like structural collapse. I understood that more than I wanted to. Daniel's reckoning was different. He'd been publicly enthusiastic about Trevor, had mentioned him in professional settings, had credited him during a presentation at his firm. When the truth surfaced, Daniel had to backtrack, had to explain to colleagues and supervisors that he'd been misled. It was humiliating in the specific way that matters to someone who values credibility above almost everything else. He called me again in late spring, 6 months after the summit. His voice was different this time, quieter, less certain. He said he'd been thinking about our last real conversation, the one where I'd suggested he verify Trevor's background. He said he'd been defensive because he'd wanted so badly for Trevor to be who he claimed, that it had felt good to have someone impressive take an interest in him, to feel like he was being mentored by someone who mattered. "I didn't want you to be right," he said. I told him I'd never wanted to be right about this, that I'd hoped I was wrong. He asked if I'd known all along that Trevor was lying. I said I'd known something was off, but that I hadn't been certain. That verification takes time, and by the time I had enough to say something definitive, he wouldn't have believed me anyway. "I should have listened," he said. I told him the truth, which was that he couldn't have, that anything I'd said would have sounded like bitterness, and he would have been right to question my motives, that some lessons only arrive through experience. There was a long pause. "I'm sorry," he said, "for assuming the worst about you, for thinking you left because you were selfish." I told him I understood, that his loyalty to his mother wasn't wrong, just incomplete, that people are more complicated than the stories we build around them. We talked for over an hour that night, longer than we'd spoken in years. He asked about my life in Krakow, about my work, about whether I was happy. I told him I was stable, which felt like a better word, that I'd learned the difference between being alone and being erased. By summer, Rebecca reached out. Not directly, she sent a message through Cassie, asking if I'd be willing to talk. I agreed. We spoke over video, the first time we'd seen each other in nearly 2 years. She looked older, tired. She didn't apologize for the marriage, and I didn't expect her to. But she said she understood now why I'd left, that she'd built a life where image mattered more than substance, and that it had cost her more than she'd realized. She said Trevor had been a mirror of that, all surface, nothing beneath, and that she'd been too invested in the presentation to see it. I told her I was sorry for what she'd gone through. I meant it. She asked if I thought she was foolish. I said no. That people believe what they need to believe, and that verification feels like suspicion until it proves necessary. That she'd trusted someone, and trust isn't a failure even when it's misplaced. We didn't become friends. but the conversation closed something that had been left open. I still live in Krakow. My work continues. Steady, quiet, sufficient. I walk along the river most mornings. My blood pressure is normal. I sleep through the night. Cassie visits once a year, and Daniel has started asking about coming, though he hasn't committed yet. I don't think about Trevor often. He was a symptom, not a cause. A man who understood that most people don't verify, that confidence can substitute for credentials if the performance is polished enough. He was wrong, eventually, but only because someone finally asked the right questions in a room where the answers mattered. The real lesson isn't about him. It's that walking away from a life that's killing you isn't cowardice. That protecting yourself doesn't require justifying yourself to people who won't hear it. That truth doesn't need your intervention to surface. It just needs time and the absence of interference. I didn't engineer Trevor's collapse. I didn't need to. I just left. And in leaving, I stopped participating in a framework where appearance mattered more than reality. The rest followed on its own. That's not revenge. It's not even justice. It's just what happens when you stop propping up a fiction. I'm 59 now. I have a small balcony where I drink tea in the evenings. I have work that matters to me. I have children who are learning, slowly. That integrity isn't about being right. It's about being honest, even when it's uncomfortable. I have peace. That was always the real victory. Look, I know you just spent the last 15 minutes reading about a guy who moved to Poland and watched his ex-wife's new boyfriend implode from across an ocean. Wild story, right? Here's the thing, stories like this don't happen in a vacuum. They happen because people ignore red flags, because we're all a little too willing to believe a good performance, and because sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is just leave. If this one hit differently for you, if you've ever felt invisible in your own life, or watched someone you care about fall for someone who didn't add up, or struggled with the choice between staying and protecting yourself, do me a favor, hit that like button. It tells me this kind of storytelling matters to you. Not the drama, not the revenge fantasy, but the quiet, messy truth about what it actually takes to rebuild your life. Share it. I guarantee you know someone who needs to read this. Maybe they're in a relationship that's slowly erasing them. Maybe they're questioning whether they're allowed to leave. Maybe they just need to be reminded that walking away isn't failure, it's survival. And subscribe. Because I'm not done telling stories like this. Real situations, real consequences, no manufactured villains. Just people navigating impossible choices and trying to come out the other side intact. Drop a comment too. I actually read them. Tell me, have you ever had to walk away from something everyone else thought you should stay in? How did you know it was time? Let's talk about it. See you in the next one.